The dust kicked up by Marcus Rodriguez's pickup truck hadn't even settled when Jake Thompson knew this conversation would change everything. Standing on the weathered porch of his family's ranch house, Jake watched the man who owed him $12,000 step out of the vehicle with shoulders that carried the weight of defeat. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, a fitting backdrop for what Jake sensed would be another disappointing encounter with someone who couldn't pay their debts. "Jake, I need to talk to you," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the yard, where several head of cattle grazed lazily in whatever shade they could find. The drought had been brutal this year, and every rancher in the county was feeling the squeeze. But Jake's situation was worse than most. He'd inherited not just his father's land, but also his father's debts, and the bank was breathing down his neck with threats of foreclosure. "If you're here to tell me you don't have my money, Marcus, you can save us both the time," Jake replied, stepping down from the porch. His boots crunched on the dry grass as he approached the truck. At 34, Jake had learned to read people's faces, and Marcus's expression told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't going to be a simple transaction. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "It's not that simple, Jake. I've got something else to offer you, something that might be worth more than the money I owe you." He gestured toward the passenger side of his truck, and for the first time, Jake noticed there was someone sitting inside. Through the dusty windshield, he could make out the silhouette of a woman. "What are you talking about, Marcus?" Jake's voice carried a warning edge. He'd known Marcus Rodriguez for 15 years, had gone to school with his younger brother, and had always considered him a decent man. But desperation made people do strange things, and Jake was beginning to suspect this was one of those moments. "Her name is Sarah," Marcus said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. She's payment for my debt. I know how it sounds, Jake, but hear me out. She's got nowhere else to go, and you need help around here. She can cook, clean, help with the ranch work. She's educated, speaks 3 languages, and she's got skills that would cost you a fortune to hire." Jake stared at Marcus in disbelief. "You're offering me a person as collateral? What kind of man do you think I am?" The very suggestion made his stomach turn. He'd been raised by a father who believed in treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. The idea of accepting a human being as payment for a debt went against everything he'd been taught. "It's not like that," Marcus insisted, glancing nervously at the truck. "She agreed to this arrangement. She needs a place to stay, and you need help. It's temporary just until I can get back on my feet and pay you properly. Think of it as employment with a guarantee." Jake ran his hand through his dark hair, a gesture he'd inherited from his father along with the ranch. Nothing about this situation felt right, but the reality of his financial situation was undeniable. The bank payment was due in 3 weeks, and he was nowhere close to having the money. His sister Emma had been after him to sell the ranch and move to the city, but this land had been in their family for 3 generations. He couldn't be the Thompson who lost it all. "Let me talk to her," Jake said finally, surprising himself with his words. He wasn't agreeing to anything, but he needed to understand what kind of desperate situation would make a woman agree to such an arrangement. As he approached the truck, he tried to prepare himself for what he might find. Probably someone down on her luck, maybe running from something, willing to do whatever it took to survive. But when the passenger door opened and Sarah Williams stepped out into the Texas heat, Jake realized he'd been wrong about everything. This wasn't a desperate woman with nowhere else to turn. This was someone who carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of education, refinement, and secrets that ran deeper than the debt that had brought her to his ranch. Her eyes met his for just a moment, and in that instant, Jake understood that accepting this arrangement would be the biggest gamble of his life, one that would either save everything he'd worked for or destroy it completely. Sarah Williams stood in the doorway of what would be her room for the foreseeable future, taking in the sparse furnishings and faded wallpaper that spoke of better times. The guest room hadn't been used since Jake's mother passed away 3 years ago, and despite Emma's efforts to keep it clean during her occasional visits, it carried the melancholy of abandonment. Yet as Sarah set down her single suitcase, the only possession she'd brought with her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of possibility. "It's not much," Jake said from behind her, his voice carrying an apologetic tone that surprised her. In the 2 hours since Marcus had driven away, leaving them to figure out this impossible arrangement, Jake had been nothing but courteous. She'd expected anger, perhaps even cruelty, but instead found a man wrestling with his own conscience about the situation they'd both been thrust into. "It's perfect," Sarah replied, running her fingers along the wooden dresser. "I haven't had a room of my own in quite some time." She turned to face him, noting how he filled the doorway with his presence. There was something solid about Jake Thompson, something that reminded her of the oak trees that had lined the driveway of her childhood home before everything changed. "You don't have to feel guilty about this arrangement, you know. I chose to be here." Jake studied her face, searching for signs of the desperation that usually drove people to make such dramatic decisions. Instead, he found intelligence in her green eyes and a composure that seemed almost out of place in someone whose circumstances had led her to his ranch as payment for another man's debt. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why would you agree to something like this?" Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of land that stretched toward the horizon. The view was breathtaking in its simplicity, rolling hills dotted with cattle, a landscape that seemed to go on forever under the enormous Texas sky. "Sometimes running towards something is the only way to escape what you're running from," she said softly. "Your ranch. It feels like a place where a person could disappear for a while." "Are you in trouble?" Jake asked, his protective instincts kicking in despite his better judgment. He'd learned to be wary of people who spoke in riddles, but there was something about Sarah that made him want to understand her story rather than dismiss it. "Aren't we all?" Sarah turned back to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But I'm not the kind of trouble that will bring danger to your door, if that's what you're worried about. I'm just someone who needs a fresh start, and you're someone who needs help keeping this place running. It seems like a fair trade." Over the next few days, Sarah proved that her claim about being useful wasn't empty boasting. She rose before dawn to help with the morning chores, demonstrating a knowledge of ranch work that surprised Jake. She could handle the horses with a gentle confidence that spoke of experience, and when she helped him repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done manual labor before. But it was in the evenings that Sarah truly revealed her mysterious nature. She would sit on the porch as the sun set, reading books that looked expensive and worn, their pages filled with what Jake glimpsed to be multiple languages. Sometimes she would hum melodies that sounded like classical music, her voice carrying across the yard with a trained quality that made him wonder about her background. When he asked about her education, she would deflect with humor or change the subject entirely. "You're not who you appear to be," Jake said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. It wasn't an accusation, but an observation, delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that came from growing up in a place where people's true natures eventually revealed themselves. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking the ears of Rex, Jake's border collie, who had quickly adopted her as his new favorite human. "None of us are exactly who we appear to be," she finally replied. "The question is whether who we really are is better or worse than what people see on the surface." She stood up, brushing dust from her jeans. "Good night, Jake. Thank you for giving me a chance to find out." As she disappeared into the house, Jake remained on the porch, staring up at the stars and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Sarah Williams was definitely not what he'd expected when he'd agreed to Marcus's desperate proposal. She was educated, mysterious, and carried herself with a dignity that seemed incongruous with her circumstances. But more than that, she was beginning to feel like a part of the ranch in a way that both comforted and concerned him. Whatever secrets she was hiding, Jake was becoming increasingly certain that discovering them would change both their lives forever. The morning Jake found Sarah in the old barn, tears streaming down her face as she held his father's journal, he realized their arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and what had begun as a desperate financial transaction had gradually transformed into something that felt dangerously close to partnership. She had become an integral part of the ranch's daily rhythm, her presence filling spaces in his life he hadn't even realized were empty. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, quickly wiping her eyes and attempting to close the leather-bound journal. "I was cleaning out the storage room and found this. I shouldn't have been reading it." Her voice carried a tremor that made Jake's chest tighten with unexpected protectiveness. In all the time she'd been there, he'd never seen her cry, never seen her composure crack even slightly. "It's okay," Jake said, settling down beside her on the hay bales. "My father would have liked knowing someone was reading his words. He always said that memories were only valuable if they were shared." He gestured toward the journal. "What made you cry?" Sarah hesitated, then opened the journal to a page she'd marked with her finger. "He wrote about your mother here, about how she used to sing while she worked in the garden, how her voice would carry across the fields and make even the hardest days seem manageable." She looked up at Jake, her green eyes still bright with unshed tears. He loved her so much. The way he describes her, it's like poetry. Jake felt a familiar ache in his chest, the one that always came when he thought about his parents and how they'd been taken from him too soon. "They were married for 32 years, he said quietly. "Dad used to say that finding her was like finding the missing piece of his soul. I always thought he was being dramatic until..." He stopped, realizing he was about to reveal more than he'd intended. "Until what?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Until you showed up and I started understanding what he meant." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them was ready to fully acknowledge. Jake had been fighting his growing feelings for Sarah, reminding himself daily that she was here because of a debt, not by choice. But sitting beside her in the barn where he'd spent countless hours as a child, surrounded by the scent of hay and leather and her subtle perfume, his resolve was crumbling. Sarah's breath caught, and for a moment Jake thought she might run. Instead, she placed her hand over his, her touch sending electricity through his entire body. "Jake, there are things about me that you don't know, things that might change how you feel about me being here." "Like what?" Jake asked, though part of him didn't want to know. These past weeks had been the happiest he'd been since losing his parents, and he wasn't ready for whatever revelation might shatter that peace. "Like the fact that I've never had to worry about money a day in my life until I chose to walk away from it all," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "Like the fact that I could probably buy this ranch 10 times over if I wanted to claim what's rightfully mine. Like the fact that I'm not here because I had nowhere else to go, but because I needed to find out who I really am when everything I thought defined me is stripped away." Jake stared at her, processing her words. "You're rich." "My family is rich," Sarah corrected. "Or they were, until I refused to marry the man they chose for me and they cut me off. But that's not the whole story." She stood up, pacing to the barn door and looking out at the fields. "The man they wanted me to marry. He's not a good person, Jake. He's powerful and ruthless, and he doesn't take rejection well. When I ran away from the wedding, I knew he wouldn't just let me go." "What does that mean?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to understand why someone like Sarah would agree to Marcus's arrangement. She wasn't just hiding from her family's expectations. She was hiding from someone who might genuinely be dangerous. "It means that eventually he's going to find me," Sarah said, turning back to face him. "And when he does, anyone who's helped me, anyone who's gotten close to me, becomes a target." She walked back to him, her eyes filled with a pain that made Jake want to promise her things he had no business promising. "I should have told you from the beginning. I should have warned you that caring about me comes with a price." Jake stood up, closing the distance between them until he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "What if I'm willing to pay that price?" "You don't understand what you're saying," Sarah whispered. but she didn't step away from him. "I understand that for the first time in 3 years, I wake up looking forward to the day because I know you'll be there," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I understand that you've brought life back to this place in ways I didn't even know were possible. And I understand that whatever trouble you're running from, you don't have to face it alone anymore." Sarah's composure finally cracked completely, and she fell into his arms as if she'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will. As Jake held her, feeling her tears soak through his shirt, he realized that what had started as a business arrangement had become something infinitely more complicated and precious. He also realized that whatever was coming for them, whatever price Sarah's past was about to demand, he was already in too deep to walk away. The woman in his arms had become priceless to him, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. The black sedan appeared on the horizon like a storm cloud, its sleek surface gleaming against the dusty ranch road as it approached the Thompson property. Jake was mending fence in the north pasture when he spotted it, and something cold settled in his stomach. In all his years living on the ranch, he'd never seen a car like that on their land. Expensive vehicles meant trouble in his experience, and given Sarah's recent revelations about her past, this couldn't be a coincidence. "Sarah!" Jake called out as he jogged toward the house, his boots kicking up dust with each urgent step. He found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared lunch, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger and more vulnerable than usual. The domestic scene would have warmed his heart any other day, but now it only increased his sense of urgency. "We have company coming," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm even as his heart raced. "Black sedan? Looks expensive. Is there something you want to tell me before they get here?" Sarah's face went pale, the wooden spoon in her hand clattering to the floor. "Robert," she whispered, the name escaping her lips like a curse. "He found me." She moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the approaching vehicle. "Jake, you have to understand this man, Robert Blackwood. He's not just wealthy, he's dangerous. He has connections everywhere, and he doesn't accept defeat." "The man your family wanted you to marry?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer from the terror in her eyes. "He's not just any businessman," Sarah said, her hands trembling as she backed away from the window. "He's involved in things that aren't legal, and he has enough money and influence to make problems disappear. When I refused to marry him, I didn't just hurt his feelings, I damaged his reputation. In his world, that's unforgivable." The sedan pulled into the yard, its engine cutting off with expensive silence. Jake watched as 2 men in dark suits emerged from the front seats, their movements precise and threatening. From the back seat stepped a man in his 50s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, wearing a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes. Even from a distance, Jake could feel the menace that radiated from Robert Blackwood like heat from a furnace. "Stay in the house," Jake told Sarah, his protective instincts overriding his common sense. "Lock the doors and don't come out no matter what you hear." "Jake, no." Sarah grabbed his arm. "You don't understand what he's capable of. He'll hurt you just to prove a point to me. Please, just let me go with him. It's not worth risking your life." "Like hell," Jake said, gently but firmly removing her hand from his arm. "You said you needed a place to disappear for a while. Well, you're under my roof now, and that means something where I come from." He looked into her eyes, seeing the fear there, but also something else, hope that someone would finally stand up for her. "Trust me, Sarah, I'm not going to let him take you." Jake stepped out onto the porch just as Robert Blackwood approached, flanked by his 2 associates. Up close, the man was even more intimidating than Jake had expected. Everything about him screamed money and power, from his handmade shoes to the gold watch that probably cost more than Jake's truck. But there was something else too, a coldness that made Jake's skin crawl. "Mr. Thompson, I presume?" Blackwood said, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of expensive education and international business. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Nothing on this ranch belongs to you," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're not welcome here, so I suggest you get back in your fancy car and drive away. Blackwood's smile widened, but his eyes remained glacial. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. You see, Sarah Williams is my fiancée. We had a little lover's spat, and she ran away to teach me a lesson. But the game has gone on long enough. He gestured toward the house. Sarah, darling, stop hiding and come out here. It's time to come home. She's not going anywhere with you, Jake said, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle he kept by the door. Sarah's here by her own choice, and she can leave the same way. Actually, Blackwood said, his tone becoming dangerously soft, I think you'll find that Sarah's choices are somewhat limited. You see, Mr. Thompson, I know all about your financial difficulties. The bank loans, the mortgage payments you're behind on, the foreclosure notices. I also know that you accepted Sarah as collateral for a debt. His smile turned predatory, which means, legally speaking, she's not free to make her own choices at all. She belongs to whoever holds that debt, and as of this morning, that someone is me. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow, but before he could fully process Blackwood's words, the front door burst open and Sarah stepped onto the porch. Her face was set with a determination that Jake had never seen before, and in her hand, she held a piece of paper that she waved toward Blackwood like a weapon. You want to talk about legal documents, Robert? Sarah's voice carried across the yard with surprising strength. Let's talk about this restraining order I filed 3 months ago, the one that specifically prohibits you from coming within 500 feet of me. She descended the porch steps with regal composure, every inch the wealthy heiress she'd been born to be. You're in violation of a court order just by being here. Blackwood's confident smile faltered for the first time. That order was filed in New York, darling. We're in Texas now, and I have reason to believe you're being held here against your will. I'm simply conducting a welfare check on my concerned fiancé. Former fiancé, Sarah corrected, her voice sharp as a blade, and I'm here entirely by my own choice. She moved to stand beside Jake, her shoulder brushing against his arm in a gesture of solidarity that sent warmth through his chest, despite the dangerous situation. Jake, there's something else you need to know about Marcus and this debt arrangement. Jake glanced at her, seeing something in her eyes that made his heart race for entirely different reasons than fear. What are you talking about? Marcus didn't just offer me as collateral randomly, Sarah said, never taking her eyes off Blackwood. Robert paid him to do it. He's been tracking me for weeks, and when he found out where I was staying, he orchestrated this entire situation. The debt, the arrangement, everything was designed to give him legal leverage over me. That's a very serious accusation, Blackwood said, but Jake could see sweat beginning to form on the man's forehead, despite the cool morning air. Do you have any proof of such a wild claim? Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, holding it up so everyone could see the screen. I have Marcus's confession, recorded yesterday when he called to warn me you were coming. He felt guilty about taking your money and wanted to make things right. She pressed play, and Marcus Rodriguez's voice filled the tense silence. Sarah, I'm sorry. Blackwood paid me $50,000 to set up the debt situation with Jake. He said he just wanted to know where you were, but I realized he was planning something worse. He bought my debt from Jake this morning, and he's coming for you. You need to get out of there. The recording ended, and Jake felt anger surge through him like wildfire. He'd been manipulated, used as a pawn in Blackwood's twisted game to reclaim a woman who clearly wanted nothing to do with him. But more than that, he realized that Marcus's betrayal meant Sarah had been in danger from the moment she'd arrived at his ranch. Interesting, Blackwood said, his composure returning with unsettling speed. But even if that recording were admissible in court, which it's not, it doesn't change the current legal reality. I own the debt, which means I own the collateral. He gestured to his associates, who began moving closer to the porch. Sarah, you can come voluntarily, or my associates can escort you. Either way, you're leaving with me. No, she's not, Jake said, stepping protectively in front of Sarah. In that moment, something crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. This wasn't just about protecting someone under his roof anymore. This was about protecting the woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd brought light back into his life when he'd thought darkness was all he had left. "Mr. Thompson," Blackwood's voice took on a dangerous edge. "I admire your protective instincts, but you're outmatched here. I have more money, more influence, and more legal resources than you could imagine. Walk away now, and I'll make sure your financial problems disappear. Continue to interfere, and I'll ensure you lose everything." Jake looked back at Sarah, seeing fear in her eyes, but also trust. Trust that he would find a way to protect her even when the odds seemed impossible. In that moment, he made a decision that would either save them both or destroy everything he'd worked for. But as he looked into her green eyes, Jake realized that losing the ranch meant nothing if it meant losing her. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake said, turning back to face Blackwood with newfound resolve. "You and your men are going to get back in that car and drive away. If you ever come near Sarah again, you'll have to deal with me. And I promise you, I'm a lot more dangerous on my own land than you think." Blackwood's laugh was cold and humorless. "We'll see about that, Mr. Thompson. We'll see about that." 2 days after Blackwood's departure, Jake found himself standing in the biggest law office in Austin, wearing his only suit and feeling completely out of place among the mahogany furniture and oil paintings of dead judges. Sarah sat beside him, no longer the mysterious ranch hand who'd arrived with a single suitcase, but Sarah Williams Ashford, heiress to one of the largest oil fortunes in Texas. The transformation was remarkable and somewhat heartbreaking. She looked like she belonged in this world of power and privilege, while he felt like an intruder. "The restraining order violation is the least of Mr. Blackwood's problems," said Margaret Chen, Sarah's attorney, as she reviewed the documents spread across the conference table. "The debt manipulation scheme, combined with the attempted coercion, gives us grounds for criminal charges. But more importantly for your immediate situation, the debt contract is null and void due to fraudulent circumstances." Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "So Sarah is free?" "Completely," Margaret confirmed. "Mr. Blackwood has no legal claim over Ms. Williams Ashford whatsoever. In fact, he's currently facing federal charges for his business practices. It seems your situation brought him to the attention of some very interested law enforcement agencies." Sarah reached over and took Jake's hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "There's something else, Jake. Something I need to ask you." She turned in her chair to face him fully, her green eyes serious but warm. "My family's board of directors has been managing the estate since I walked away. They want me to come back to take my place as head of the company." Jake's heart sank, though he tried not to let it show on his face. He'd known this moment would come, had been preparing himself for it since he'd learned who she really was. "That's wonderful, Sarah. You belong in that world." "Do I?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but determined. "Because I've been thinking about what belonging really means these past few weeks, and I think it has less to do with where you come from and more to do with where you choose to make your home." Before Jake could respond, Sarah continued, "I want to make you an offer, Jake Thompson, a business proposition that could benefit both of us." "What kind of proposition?" Sarah smiled, and Jake could see both nervousness and excitement in her expression. "I want to invest in your ranch, not as a buyout, but as a partnership. We expand the operation, bring it into the modern era, create something that honors your family's legacy while building something new together." She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "That is, if you think you could stand having a business partner who comes with a lot of baggage and a tendency to cook breakfast before dawn." Jake stared at her, processing her words. "Are you asking me to be your business partner, or something more?" "I'm asking if you think a ranch hand who happens to be worth several $1 million might have a permanent place on your ranch." Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm asking if you meant what you said about being willing to pay the price for caring about me. Because the price might be spending the rest of your life with a woman who's never been happier than she was mucking out stalls and mending fences beside you." Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. For a moment, Sarah looked stricken, as if she thought she'd misread everything between them. Then Jake dropped to one knee beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Sarah Williams Ashford," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought you were payment for a debt, but it turns out you're the most valuable thing that's ever happened to me. If you're willing to tie your fortune to a struggling cattle ranch and a man who's never owned a suit that fits properly, then yes, I think we can make this partnership work." As Sarah laughed and threw her arms around his neck, Jake realized that sometimes the most priceless things in life came disguised as business transactions. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you discovered that what you thought you were losing was actually what you'd been searching for all along.